on an account which ignores this history, we need to stand with the Marxist theorist Ernst Bloch. I don't know if you know the work of Ernst Bloch, Natural Rights and Human Dignity. I think it is one of the best Marxist texts on law. Underread. Yeah? But for Bloch, the tradition of natural rights is always a tradition of struggle, is always a tradition of resistance, and it can be a tradition of resistance against commodification. And if we hold on to a long history of natural rights, we can see that. And we can also see how this language of the commons, of social property, of use, is there when we talk about contemporary environmental debates of the commons, or the language of occupy, yeah? Or in a language arguing against the commodification of intellectual property. This is a natural rights language as well. Yeah? So we can't jettison that tradition. And if we jettison that tradition, we lose a strong discourse of resistance and critique. The second point, or the second qualification. I think today there is a tendency of many critical readings of global politics to rely too heavily on the work of Giorgio Agamben. And the work of Hart and Negri would be one example, in which we want to read, critical theorists want to reread a history of liberal capitalism as state of exception, as homo sacer, as bare life. Now there's merit in this. There's certainly merit in this. What gets missed, I think, because what gets missed is that alongside a legal language of security and exception, which gets extended to international law, there's a really interesting history of natural rights and international law which does something very similar, but does so at a level of economic governance. So it's not the grand ahistorical bare life, it's a more simple mode of economic governance which uses suspension, openness, and closure. So I'll give an example. Hugo Grotius is often seen as the father of modern international law. A Dutch thinker writing in the early 1500s, the Common Era. And early Hugo Grotius is writing on behalf of a commercial organization, a shipping company, and he's arguing for the free sea. He's arguing for free trade. He gives a natural rights argument for free trade, for commerce, which is the proto-version of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And if you read Adam Smith's lectures on jurisprudence, the links from Smith to Grotius through Pufendorf are clear. A few years later, when Grotius is arguing, writing his major book on War and Peace, the Dutch are now in a position of dominance of parts of the High Sea, and he's arguing against British attempts, French attempts to break in to trade routes. So he argues the opposite. He argues, along with the English writer John Selden, for a Meerklausel, an idea of a closed sea. Yeah? Now what's interesting in this is Grotius effectively holds on to these two elements, or these two options. The argument for free trade, natural rights, and an open sea, and then using the same natural rights argument to suspend rights to trade, and argue for a state protectionism, a state mercantilism, a closed sea, a closing of trade. So what I argue, and you can trace this tradition backwards to Thomas Aquinas, you can trace it forwards to Adam Smith. What I argue is that Grotius is presenting a technique of governance which is key to the development of the Western liberal legal form. And this is not the grand story of Homo Sacer, of an exception. It's a smaller story where liberal thought uses a dual technique of governance. One of openness, free markets, rights. One of closure, suspending rights, protectionism. And this is a managerial technique or a form of governance which runs through the natural rights tradition. It's not picked up by Foucault in the book of biopolitics. It's generally not picked up outside of liberal theory. And it runs through and it helps to explain economic arguments, liberal economic arguments about enclosures, about war economies, about strategies of late development, say Friedrich List, about protectionism, and about the way state hegemonies operate, can open markets in one regime and close markets to others. So this is a more subtle, it's a more prudential form of thought which runs through liberal theory, but I think it's key to the liberal form. Two more points and then I should be done. The third point about the legal form, and I think if we go back to this architecture which I've tried to present, the relationship between natural rights thinking, the emergence of what I call socially antagonistic capital accumulation, and the third part of state hegemony, what links these three things together and is often underemphasized within critical theory or legal critical theory is the concept, Marx's concept of primitive or original accumulation. Ursprünglich accumulation, my German is horrible, but primitive or original accumulation. And I think this is key when we're trying to link the story of natural rights to capital accumulation to state hegemony. It's this key concept in Marx which does so much work and helps us to explain the relationship between capital accumulation and violence, which links the state back to the legal form, back to the economic form. And I think there's a lot of literature on this, obviously, but we should not read Marx's theory of primitive or original accumulation at the end of capital as if it just happens once and then it sets labourers free in a double sense, and that's it. Then we just have the economy runs along smoothly, we have extra economic coercion. What we need to read the concept of primitive accumulation as, we need to read it in the same way I think Benjamin read it, that is, it's an always ongoing process. So when Benjamin is talking about, Walter Benjamin is talking about the role of the state, the role of violence as a creative and preserving violence, this is what original accumulation is. It is a creative and preserving violence. It is an ongoing violence. We can see in some of the recent writing by Mark Neocleous, which I'm good friends with Mark, and we agree on this. The role of just war is a form of original accumulation. So the state form of war needs to be read as a form of international accumulation at the interstate level, linking colonialism to just war. It's creating markets in the sense of what Karl Polanyi would talk about, the creation of markets. This is the violence at the bottom of the creation of markets, and it's the violence of security which sustains markets. And I think it's important to reclaim, for legal theorists, to reclaim the concept of original accumulation or primitive accumulation as a legal concept. And it was a legal concept for Marx. If we go back through the history of natural law thinking, we have a range of thinkers drawing upon Roman humanist scholarship, looking at what's the foundation of property. So for Grotius, when he's looking at the foundation of property, how do we justify private property? He gives arguments in relation to necessity, arguments in relation to self-preservation, arguments in relation to consent and agreement. What he also looks at is an argument, it's not an argument, but what he looks at is the idea that what happens at where property comes from is from seizure, from taking of possession, which is always a crime, because it's always the taking of someone. Rousseau picks this up. Proudhon picks this up. The crime of theft at the beginning of all property. And so when Marx is writing about primitive or original accumulation, he's writing in a juridical tradition. He's going back to his training as a lawyer. And we need to emphasize the concept of original or primitive accumulation as a key legal concept which links natural rights thinking, capital accumulation, and state hegemony. It's doing it. And the final point, I think the final point is to not forget how much work the modern state still does, the political form of the modern state. And then when we're looking at the historical development of international law, when we respond to the liberal optimists, or we respond to the liberal pragmatists, the moral pragmatism, and for them, the war on terror is something of an aberration, it's an exception, it's something different, it's something exceptional to the liberal order and the rule of law. It's just state politics. It's just Washington neoconservatives. Our argument has to go back and go, no, within the historical development of international law, state hegemony, especially as colonization, and as soft imperialism has played a key role. So what is at the heart of international law is state terror, the terror of the state. And this is a terror of primitive and original accumulation. This is the terror of opening markets and of closing markets. Okay? And so state terror is the most normal thing for the historical development of liberal international law. Which is why contemporary international law, contemporary liberal international law, even when it has moments of resistance within it, which I think it does, is always a nightmare and not a happy dream. Okay, thank you.
Arkadaşlar, arkadaşa getirebilir miyiz? Kulaklık. Simon'da var.
Thank you, Tarık and Simon, for your valuable insights and arguments about the operation of state and also modern and neoliberal state and also the international law. And now we will take questions, and you can ask your questions in English or in Turkish. Our friends will translate them in English if you ask in Turkish. Any questions?
Bir de soruları eğer if you ask questions in Turkish, please ask slowly.
Türkçe soracağım. Ben Tarık Koç'ya sormak istiyorum ve doğrudan ilintili mi konuşmasıyla bilmiyorum ama ben IŞİD'i bu ilk sel birikim bağlamında değerlendirdiğimizde nasıl bir tablo çıkar karşımıza. Onu sormak istiyorum. İkinci olarak da kritik ya da eleştirel düşünce için yine IŞİD'i nasıl değerlendirmeli eleştirel düşünce? Bana liberal doğrulara karşı çıkmadan IŞİD eleştirilebilir mi? Bu konuda insan hakları ve benzer diğer kavramlar nereye oturur? Bunları nasıl ilişkilendirebiliriz? Onu sormak istiyorum.
Obviously is firstly a Western discourse of Orientalism, one which portrays ISIS or other Islamist political groups as barbarians, as evil. So what critical theory must try to do is undercut or undermine any attempt to portray this always at the level of moral thinking. You know? So the mode of critique has to be firstly historical, it has to be geopolitical, you know? And then it has to ask questions about capital accumulation, you know? And specifically about thinking about what kind of violence operates at the foundation of a state, which is the grasping of territory, which is the grasping of resources, which is the privatization of otherwise someone else's land. And these would be interesting questions to ask in the attempt of ISIS to create its own state. What type of accumulation is going on there? You know? And I think it's clear. It's a nice example of thinking about how violence then relates to the foundation of statehood and to different property forms. You know? But I don't know enough about them to say anything more. But thank you for your question.
On ISIS either. All I would say is ISIS appear. I mean, the interesting thing about ISIS, of course, is that they, from what I do know, is limited, is there's a strange thing where on the one hand they claim to be, at least from what I can tell, trying to create a sort of caliphate, which is supposed to sort of go back all the way to Muhammad. And yet on the other hand, they are framing it in a very modern notion of a state. And what I have seen amongst commentators about people who do know something more about the subject than perhaps either of us do, is there appears to be some controversy, people looking at ISIS and analysing it, to what extent, when they call themselves Islamic State, well, A, are they really Islamic, which is perhaps a theological question, but B, are they really creating a state? Now, I don't know, that's a question I can't answer. But all I would say is I mean, obviously, one thing I should just say in passing, it's very nice to be on a panel where we had a very clear disagreement, and I was rather enjoying the fact that Tariq was critiquing both my theoretical inspirations here, Patrikonis and the government. Hopefully we can debate that a bit more. But one of the things I think we did agree about, and we take something from is Benjamin, and perhaps all I would suggest about Islamic State is that perhaps they haven't broken out of that contradiction or that framework that Benjamin identified, which is this oscillation between law preserving and law constituting violence, both of which essentially keep replicating the notion of law and of power relations that go along with it. In other words, that ISIS on one hand is seeking to destroy, and there's some ideological justification to this, but seeking to destroy the state system in the Middle East that was created by the colonial powers. Yet at the same time they are seeking to create a new state which seeks to impose itself upon unwilling populations. So maybe just looking at it in that way, they are, in a sense, far from being really radical and revolutionary in any kind of real sense, are, and in a very essential sense, very ultra-conservative. So maybe that's all I would say about ISIS looking at that.
Any other questions? Başka soru arkadaşlar?
I just had a question for Simon about the pertinence or the challenges of applying or thinking the present through Pakshukanis, and in particular regarding this question of the legal subject and the way that you interpreted the question of the legal subject in terms of atomization. And I wonder if one of the, this is by no means an original argument, but I wonder if one of the limitations of Marxist traditions of thinking critically about the law has been an inability to think actually of all the ways in which capitalist law has a whole set of dimensions which actually are not about the individual property owning subject. That is to say, already in Marx's time, and it's not that Marx didn't deal with it, but he did not deal with it necessarily from the legal level. The creation of joint stock companies, the entire structure of corporations, and so on and so forth. So that more and more, as that's one of the contradictions, that there is this combined movement of yes, atomization, politically, ideologically, and so on, but there's also immensely powerful socializing tendencies to capitalism itself, which are of course extremely significant to Marx and to Lenin and to others. And those socializing tendencies find themselves articulated at the legal level as well. And so in that sense, wouldn't it be limited to think, wouldn't it be limited to reduce the legal subject to the legal fiction of the individual commodity exchanger, when what we see on a quotidian level is that actually the power of contemporary capital, the power of credit agencies, the power of hedge funds, the power of banks manifests itself very much through a power which is legally mediated, in which they do not appear as individuals, or not in any straightforward way, just as individuals. So that we would need a more maybe capacious conception of legal subjectivity than the one afforded by Pakshukanis.
Occasionally bothers me because yes, there are, of course, we can think of collective legal subjects such as a joint stock company, something like that, hedge funds and so on, but also things like trade unions. Trade union can have a legal personality and so on. What I would say is that, first of all, if you look at Pakshukanis, what he would say, I think, he doesn't deal, I think, quite with the notion of that question, but he would say that somebody says that the irreducible atom of legal relations, of law, is the individual legal subject. And I'm certainly no expert on commercial law and things like this, how it works, but my understanding is that even if you looked at, say, a hedge fund, or stockholders in a company, or that the company had a legal personality, you can, if you like, dig deeper further. What is that company made of? What is made of individual shareholders, or if you go to a hedge fund, again, there are individual investors who have rights within. In other words, you have a joint stock company, you have a hedge fund, you have a trade union, whatever. People have rights even within those structures. If you keep going down and down and down, you end up with a legal subject, and that's fundamental. That would be the ultimate basis of it. At the same time, having said that, I think you're right to say that I don't think this means, I think you're right to say that there are ways in which subjectivity is constructed, where we do have various forms of collective subject in society, which colour or fill out our notion of social relationships, which cannot simply be reduced down to, or just cannot simply be read off from the commodity form theory of law. And so perhaps work has to be done with that. I would say that certainly when I'm talking about, for example, the state and so forth, that's where I see a government offering something. When you come to the question of actors in the market, such as joint-stock companies and so on. Yes, perhaps more work needs to be done on it. I am simply saying that, for me, and I've yet to come across any other theory in the Marxist tradition, or in any tradition for that matter, that I think explains in as concrete a manner as possible the role of law and what law is and how it functions and specificity to capitalism and so on and so forth. But you know, Pashakan's book is so big, and I think a lot more needs to be done to develop from that. But I think your point is a good one. Yeah, I'd have to think it through. Perhaps it would ultimately negate Pashakan's theory, but not necessarily so, because as I said, ultimately the atom of legal relationship does come down to the individual subject. Thank you.
Başka, then we can just close the session. I just want to remind you that our next session will... Oh, sorry.
Okay. Do you mind if that's okay? I'd like to...
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay, it's okay. I have some questions for Tariq. The first is, you talked about the Franciscans, and you were trying to show that, as I understand it, that there is this history of posing and natural rights in opposition to notions of property and law. And one of the things I found very interesting in Agamben, and I don't know if you, I think most recent book in the Homo Sacer series is a study of the Franciscans, it's called On the Highest Poverty, or Of the Highest Poverty. And what's interesting there is that what Agamben argues is that whereas Francis himself very much resisted the church, the canon lawyers, refused to give ground on the idea that you can have any kind of property. And he counterposed the notion of the use of things. And that the Franciscans, in everything they had and everything, it was merely about use, but they never asserted a property over it. And Agamben contrasts, if you like, Francis's position with his followers, who come after his death. And what he says is that actually, what the problem with the Franciscans themselves is that they began to engage with the canon lawyers precisely on the basis of natural rights, which is a legal framework. And so they said, well, because one of the things the canon lawyers proposed to them was, oh, you talk about just free use common property and such. But what about when a Franciscan eats something? How can that be common use? You either use it as yours, you can't then share it, And the Franciscans sort of got caught up in this and started saying, well, you could have exceptions. Interesting use of here, Agamben picked up on the exceptions. So here, whereas the Franciscans talk about the norm being not law, they start talking about an exception where there would be some property, which would be property over the clothes you wear or the food you eat. And Agamben's argument is essentially this is the downfall of the Franciscans, and this is why ultimately the Franciscans ideologically and in every other way are essentially defeated quite conclusively by the church, because once you open the door to the notion of some form of right, then of course it's just, well, if you can have rights to clothes and you can have rights to food, what about the right to the place you live in, the bed you sleep on, and so on and so on and so forth. And you end up losing any concept of the notion of common use or the commons. But that would be just one thing I would say about that. I absolutely agree with you about the critique of Agamben's historiography. I think you're absolutely right on that. My question really is, if I understood you correctly, at one point you said you had a critique of the Marxist teleology of conflict, violence, and transformation. In other words, the idea of conflict between classes and so forth at an international level that leads to a form of violence, and that potentially, in Lenin's conception and others, to some kind of world war into civil war type thing. But you said we have to reject that. And you seem to be suggesting that is one of the building blocks of liberal international law. I wasn't quite clear about what you were just saying on that. Maybe I misunderstood you, but thank you.
So let's fight.
No fighting. Fighting's not good. Yeah, no, thanks for the questions. They're good questions. On the Franciscans are an example. And we can't all become Franciscans. We don't want to become Franciscans. And if you've read Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose, or seen the really bad film version with Sean Connery, but what the Name of the Rose also points to is a variety of Franciscan thought, and the attempt of the order disciplining its own members, a radicalness of radical Franciscans. So the point is really, Franciscans and the question of use. So the response about eating food is the papal response. It's the response that Grotius adopts as a justification for private property, which becomes a key liberal response. On the other hand, even something like use, in that example, when people like Occam are engaging with papal canon lawyers, okay, they give something up, surely. Yeah? They enter into a particular legal jurisdiction. So moving into any legal jurisdiction, you give something up. Yeah? When you make arguments within certain rights, they give something up as well. On the other hand, there is something really interesting about the idea of use. The idea that there's a commonality or a sociality of property or resources, and that you don't have absolute ownership over it. And the assertion of some form of social communal use can operate in any sort of cooperative system. Yeah? And it's important to hold on to that. It is commodification in the sense that any co-op still has to operate as a legal subject. They have to buy and sell property. Yeah? You can't transcend your way out of it. You can't transcend your way out of commodification. The only transcendence would have to be Benjaminian revolution, which is divine, which may not be divine for those who get their throats cut. Yeah? The point I'm trying to make is not so much about the Franciscans. It's a Hegelian point about law. Yeah? So Hegel, in the beginning of the early parts of the phenomenology of spirit, he's trying to make, and this is an argument I make in my book, The Other's War, he's trying to link the question of how do we generate norms? How do we generate norms as social beings? And what kind of violence, what form of coercion is taking place in the generation of social norms? This is what Hegel is talking about in the discourse of recognition. It's a language of contestation. It's a language of struggle. Now, you could take this through the language turn all the way to Derrida, and this is what Derrida was talking about in terms of violence in the world. No? Or Lyotard in other ways. No? But we could take it back through a Marxist tradition and the work of Ernst Bloch in his writing of natural law, and this is an attempt to redescribe what these authors are talking about. And so even though their moments of contestation might be limited, I think it's important to hold on to those moments of contestation. In the same way, another way to describe it would be, so Foucault on resistance, the importance is holding on to an analysis of micropower, but an analysis of micro forms of resistance. And so we can reread the natural law tradition through Bloch as these forms of resistance against particular forms of law, against moments of commodification. Now they will be limited, They will be pathetic in some instances. But to think about this in another aspect, it means we're still thinking about struggle which is within legal discourse and which is attached to political action and which is attached to fighting, violence and conflict as well. So that's the broader point I'm making. And the Franciscans, merely just an entry point. The second point was merely that I think there's one teleological account which is in microforming Grotius, and it becomes persistent through liberal thinkers like Locke, Adam Smith, Kant, is that private interest, Bernard Manville, private interest, property, selfishness leads to prosperity, prosperity and free trade leads to global peace. Yeah? So if you wanted to write a new birth of biopolitics, yeah, it's not the physiocrats, it's much earlier, it's natural law thinking, it's Grotius. The second teleological account which we need to be critical of is the idea of the difference between symmetrical and asymmetrical conflict. The idea that the historical forces of capitalism will lead to two sides fighting it out. Yeah? I think that's what we need to be similarly critical of. Yeah? Because it might not be two sides fighting it out. It might just be lots of actors getting smashed. Yeah? And the historical outcome we have at the moment is not an asymmetrical conflict of two bodies fighting it out in Marx or in Lenin. What we have is lots of smaller actors getting smashed. And we may just have to be pessimistic about that. Or we may not. But buying into any teleological account of history, I think, is as silly as buying into the teleological account given by liberal thought in property. They share the same lineage. And something interesting in post-structuralism which tries to get rid of that, and that's important. Cheers.
Okay, so I would like to close. If any other questions? Last time I'm asking. So if there is no other questions, then I just want to remind you that the next panel will be on the agenda of agenda of law and state in Turkey, and it will start at 4:45. Thank you.
Herkese merhabalar. Günün son oturumunda birlikteyiz. Son oturumda Türkiye'de hukuk ve denetim gündemi başlığı altında Sayın Murat Özver'i, Sayın